So, so there was some discussion within Semantic Arts of whether or not this topic would fill up the entire meeting. And my thought was, have you ever been with a group of ontologists? So please, do feel free to chime in as we move along. This is an approach to this idea. Would be interested to hear alternative ideas. But I do think this is a concept we do need to capture in the retail version of GIST, if you will. Why is it not? There we go. So I had noticed a while back, as probably had others, that there was this missing concept, and GIST has always been about being focused on businesses, that we want to help businesses do things. And that helps us limit our scope. It helps us frame our context for certain concepts as well. But one of the really kind of basic concepts that's been missing, was that of the asset. So, in this meeting, we propose kicking off additions to GIST to cover this concept, and kick off the discussion about, is this the right structure and how they might be used. Asset is not necessarily the only thing, the class of things that can be owned. And in GIST, our paradigm is generally that we want to establish at the top level of our ontology the most flexible and extensive classes. That's why we wind up with classes like intention, which at first glance you kind of go, what? But then you look at some of the subclasses underneath it, and it begins to make more sense, and you understand why we took a class as broad and sort of nebulous as intention. And so we're going to do a similar sort of thing by proposing this top level class that we're going to call Ownable. And the English language definition of that being, a thing over which a person or a corporation may exercise ownership rights. And we'll get a little bit into, what we mean by the ownership rights as we move along. So that question of ownership rights, kind of opens the thing of, well, what things can be owned? We said in our English definition, that it is, it is a thing, it can be owned, or that a person or corporation can exercise rights over. So this question of, well, what is that thing? What kind of things can be owned is a little trickier than it might appear. And whoever just arrived, if you could please mute yourself. Thank you. Hello, could the person who just arrived mute themselves?
Oh, sorry, John Cowan.
All right, thank you. So,
John, I was just quoting you. You missed it, but you can hear it on the recording.
So there are different flavors, if you will, of ownership. So the contents of your refrigerator, the food that you have bought, you own that. Nobody's going to dispute your ownership of it, except who gets that last pudding cup. You and maybe the bank together might own your car, assuming you bought it and not leased it. And decades ago, literally decades ago, you owned your copy of the software operating system on your computer. These days, you probably don't own the operating system on your computer. You probably only have bought the right to use it. And that right may be temporary. It's maybe one of those things where it will, if you're going on a month-to-month thing, it might disappear. So that is a kind of ownership that is evolving, that we need to take into account. If you have created a piece of software or some similar thing that you have created, but of which multiple copies can exist, then in that case, it might be better to talk about you owning the intellectual property rights to the thing rather than the thing itself, because digital copies are, necessarily a little intangible. And you probably do not own land, but instead there's an arrangement with the government that we'll talk about a little more on a later slide. So in thinking about what would constitute this upper class for ownable, we believe that an ownable thing may be a member of one of the 4 GIST classes that currently exist. It might be intellectual property. It might be a right, and actually in a later slide I'll say this is something we're actually bringing back into GIST. It might be an artifact, and it might be a physical identifiable item, excluding person. And I do make this note that if you need to create a class in which persons can be owned, please create it using your own namespace. We don't want to have semantic arts name associated with that sort of thing.
What do you mean by artifact?
All right, so I've got a slide of that coming up because that is a fairly new addition to GIST. So we can.
What do I have to do to see slides? It didn't seem to be in the invite.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's in the email. Okay, thanks. No, sorry for the noise.
Okay. So we compose this restriction using the subclass of instead of the equivalent to an equivalent class or statement, because not every instance of one of these things is necessarily ownable. There are some rights that you couldn't be said to own. There are intellectual property things that are in the public domain, so you don't get to own them. And if you were to try inferring class membership, you might get invalid results. So we decided just to treat it as a subclass construct.
And Dan, before you leave this slide, I think in GIST accounting, instead of physical identifiable item, I think we had physical thing, which included substance, because I think substances can be owned as well.
Good
Well,
point.
there's if you'll recall, Dave, we've gone around about how we handle substance.
Yep.
Lots of substance. A package of a substance can be owned.
Yeah, there should be an amount of an item that is an amount of substance.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, no,
So
that's what substance is defined to mean. I mean, the word substance is used in different ways, but in GIST it means an amount of stuff.
Yeah. But in basic GIST, as I recall, somebody please to mute. Echo. I believe we have substance still in physical substance as a. We do not have physical thing that we don't have that construct. Okay.
Dan, I'd like to make a comment. Well, if somebody needs to mute, because I actually can't hear myself talk when I'm hearing double.
It might be rude.
What?
If somebody is on the phone and the laptop, you should mute one of them.
Yeah. So about the person exclusion, I would, in my opinion, that's something we would handle with shackle, in that I don't think semantic arts needs to be thought of as endorsing ownership of it by allowing it in the ontology, but that's merely a recognition of the fact that that could be true in some societies or.
Could everybody mute except Rebecca and Dan and see how that goes?
Okay, are we better now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Rebecca, give it a shot.
Oh, do I need to repeat myself?
I'm afraid so, yes.
So in my.
Now we lost you.
You want me to save it or you want me to go ahead with it?
We need you to repeat what you'd said earlier.
Okay. So I would say that in my opinion, this should be relegated to a shackle constraint, because there are some legal systems and societies and economies that would allow ownership of persons. And I don't think semantic arts needs to be viewed as approving of that just because the ontology allows it. The ontology is not really making moral statements.
We have cybercrime ontologies, for example.
Right. No, I agree. In fact, it was at LexisNexis they pointed out exactly they have laws that, on their books that go back to a time when that was literally true in the United States.
Okay. Then anybody else want to express an opinion on that?
Would it be possible? Would it be possible to add shackle as a part of shackle constraints as a part of the changes to GIST that you're proposing, so that that could come along with it, so that everyone who wants to enforce excluding GIST person would be able to, and the like?
I'll defer to Dave on that, because that does kind of open up the whole thing of a project of creating a baseline shackle that we would provide.
Yeah, an interesting idea. I mean, we would only provide sort of a starter set, because our opinion is you could have different shackles for the same ontology in different repos. It's possible. I haven't even sat down to think about how much work that would be. It's not an impossible large task, although we'd have to get a bunch of people to agree on it. Well, no, I guess you don't really have to agree.
If you're talking about just putting in sample shackle so people could build it into their systems, that's one thing, but it doesn't really need to have shackle that has to go with GIST, because basically then you're doing the same thing as building it into the ontology. And there's no way to, as Dave said, no way to enforce that somebody uses that shackle. Yeah, I really feel, just to repeat myself, we've talked about this in other contexts, like does a person have to have a birth date? And I don't think we should get ourselves into the quandary of making ethical judgments. We just should be representing the facts as they are.
On the topic of shackle, that is quite an interesting idea. I have not explored this at all, but I'm pretty sure shackle has some facility for doing rules and inference. I think it's based on spin. So there are plenty of things you cannot say in OWL that you can say in a more powerful rule language like shackle. So it is possible we could have shackle alongside OWL. It is part of semantics. But that's a bit of a side issue. Ownable, what we're talking about.
Okay.
There's something that I was just coming across in terms of background reading for this, which is a paper relating to intellectual property and they were talking also about land property rights. One of the things that they were saying about this ownership business was that one of the other elements that they added was intent. So I'm only raising it here because what you're talking about is how it may relate to existing just classes, and so some sort of intent or intention might be involved there. The other one was time. The ownership had got sometimes a restricted period of time. We deal with that.
Yeah, and we'll have a a slide that will kind of expand on that idea a little later. So let's be sure and come back though to that idea of the expiring right, the expiring ownership that might go with that. So it does sound like that the consensus is to remove the not person restriction out of here. That's what I get for encouraging discussion.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on. Now we'll kind of take a quick look at those component classes that went into that definition, just to wrap up any questions that might be around there. Physical identifiable item is probably the most straightforward of those things, because in principle, most physical items, potentially can be owned. I like the thing of, in this note that has been added, that you could, at least in principle, put an RFID tag on members of the physical identifiable item class. It's of course not always physically possible, but in terms of just helping you solidify the concept in your head, that's one of the things that I've found very useful. When we get to some of the more intangible things that might be owned, most of those get covered by this concept of the artifact, or a lot of them that we'd be dealing with in businesses. Artifact is fairly new in GIST. Its subclasses include these things like components of networks, the networks themselves, systems, things that are almost of their nature built up out of other things, some of which might be tangible, like a server, some of which might not be, like software. So we have this class to cover that, an intentional person-made thing, that can be physical or content. The other intangible class that we kind of deal with is intellectual property. The definition here, a work, invention, or concept, which is independent of whatever medium it's expressed in, captured in, and we also include the idea of brands under intellectual property. But so these are, again, things that you can own. You can own your brand. You can own the novel that you wrote. So the intellectual property, is the proper way to express that, because you can't necessarily own every copy of the book that you wrote, be it physical or electronic, once it gets published. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Something that can be owned, does that imply necessarily that you can sell or transfer that to someone else can own it?
That would be, yeah. and maybe that's something we ought to add into the English, comment description is, that it is a thing that can be transferred, by.
Actually, I think there are exceptions now that I think of it. A software program, sometimes it very explicitly says not transferable. You paid for the software.
But the owner of, again, you only own the license, and we'll get to that in a minute, but
transferability is one of your rights.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
If I sell the laptop, that copy of the software is on, to somebody, I guess, the ownership transfers as well.
Right. What I'm saying is, I think that there are some cases where you own something, but you do not. That ownership does not include the ability to transfer it to someone else, so someone else can now own it.
Okay.
Right. And it's mostly because you don't literally own things. You own rights to things.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm bringing up this slide now, because the other class that's in that definition of ownable is right. And this is something we had in just in an earlier version. It got taken out and put in just Fin, but we need to bring it back in order to properly cover the idea of an ownable. So it is a permission that you've essentially been given or you purchased. Some of those rights are transferable. Sometimes they're not. It would depend upon the context by which you receive those rights, which is usually tied to an agreement.
In fact, the related concept here, and we really got into this in just Fin with the idea of bank accounts, which I think is a great example. Ownership and possession are not the same. Whereas, the stuff in your fridge, ownership and possession go hand in hand. So we tend to think of them that I have the right to eat the apple, but your bank has certain rights over your money, but they don't own it.
Yeah.
They have the right to factor it to make more loans, but they don't actually own it.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't be heard at all before I was on the phone. I have serious objections that go back quite a ways because I've been trying to talk for some time. So let me back up to persons.
Okay.
Do we intend by ownership to mean legal ownership?
I would think so.
Yeah.
And enforceable ownership. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that case, there is no country in the world that permits ownership today of people. It doesn't exist. There's illegal slavery, but there's no legal slavery anywhere.
Suppose you want to model previous societies.
Fair enough. I just wanted to make this point.
There's no claim that just only allows us to model what exists today.
Fair enough.
So how do you handle parent-child relationships where a child is I wouldn't say owner, but offspring? Right. They have rights over that child until they become an adult.
Okay, so that's the other thing I wanted to say. Technically speaking, you never own anything tangible. What you own is rights, period.
Yep.
So, if you saying it's a reasonable thing in a business ontology to say, okay, I own this, I own it, I own my toothbrush, but actually what I own is a certain set of rights over the toothbrush. I can destroy it, I can do all kinds of things with it. I can brush my teeth with it, I can brush my cat's teeth with it.
Isn't that also again an artifact of our particular legal system?
I don't think so. I think that's a general rule of jurisprudence.
If you go back to feudal societies, for example, where
okay, let me just interrupt here, because one of the first things I pointed out on the first slide is that GIST has always been intended to be a business-oriented ontology.
Just so.
We do not want to model the world. We do not want to model all of his history. There are other ontologies, who are oriented towards that, but that is not really where GIST needs to go. So
that raises a broader question, Dan, which is, I thought you were going to start with use cases requirements. So what are the things that you need to be able to do that you can't do? Because we've had ownership back and forth, but never really got used, which is why it went away. So what are the use cases that you're driving for, the reason you think you need to have it? So keep that in the background, not necessarily answer at this moment, but part of what should be driving this.
So the use case.
If I could,
Yeah,
Dan,
I'm sorry, go ahead. And
just, I had trouble unmuting as well, and just springboarding off what Michael just said. I actually created an ownable class in the Morgan Stanley Research Ontology because there wasn't one in MS Core. And the reason I did is because I needed the concept of an asset. And there are two kinds of assets, financial assets and economic assets. An economic asset is something real, such as real estate or other personal property, whereas a financial asset is created by a financial instrument. So I needed to combine those two things under an asset category, and it made sense to put that under ownable. So just to frame a little bit, what's the business use of ownable? The other thing I do want to mention without going down a rabbit hole is one way to get your head around what ownership really is, which is it's a legal right, is that it's different from possession.
Right, correct.
Something you can own it without possessing it. For instance, if you rent an apartment that you own to someone else, you still own the apartment, but the renter possesses it, etc. So it helps to remember that ownership and possession are separate.
Yep.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to bring up is there any particular reason why this class should be called property?
Because all properties are ambiguous.
Oh, yeah, complicated names, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, fair enough.
Yep. But yeah.
Well, also property suggests that somebody does own it, that it's somebody's property, whereas ownable only suggests that somebody might own it.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yep. Well, Dan, you were right. There's plenty of material for 2 slides.
Mark is trying to comment. He needs to be unmuted. Yeah. Mark Auska.
Or maybe not. But let's see. The idea, though, of a right, is something that usually is specified somewhere, either in an agreement. It may be specified as a matter of law. But there are, and when there's ambiguity, that's when courts get involved, or some sort of arbitrator. But the idea is that it is it is a permission that is, framed and agreed upon, and frequently a right is tied to an obligation, but it's not necessarily always tied to one. Okay.
Yeah, if anyone wants to drill deeper into that, there's this whole domain called Hofeldian analysis, Hofeldian. There was a guy in one of our classes who had studied this, and we looked at it a lot when I was refactoring GIST accounting and GIST fin. It's all about how one person's obligation can, but doesn't necessarily create someone else's right.
Well, duty and right are the correlatives, and that's so because if I have a right to something, if I have a right to my property, you have the duty of staying off it, and so do you, and so do you, and so do you. It's not necessarily 1-to-1, but it necessarily exists.
So can I be heard at this time?
Now you can.
Yeah.
All right. The point that I was trying pretty desperately to make earlier is that the original definition of ownership was self-referential. It said that it granted ownership rights. And the idea of including an example of transference is a more effective definition than having the self-referential definition that was initially in there. We're past the point of the discussion, but I think that is an important point for clarity of definitions.
Well, except that I think we identified that some ownership is non-transferable. So if that's the case, it can't be a core part of the definition of ownership.
Okay, I think that was one of the things we were getting to is what would be an example of non-transferable ownership?
Entailed property.
Right.
My right
Actually,
to use operating system Windows 10 or something like that. I don't know if I can transfer that. So I might be able to, but there's some cases where you can't.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's one of the cases where you can't.
Yeah, I mean, there are cases where you invest in closely held companies that are, you can own it and not be able to transfer it.
But is that not the case, though? You still only own a right?
You always only own a right. One or more
Right.
rights.
Well,
So
I don't know. I
maybe
thought we were talking about the stuff in your refrigerator. Once you eat it and it's gone.
But
Well,
you,
if that, we've got an
And-
interesting case here. If maybe we don't need ownable, we just need right, because the only thing that's ownable is a right. So get rid of ownable and just keep right if we need it at all.
All right, so how, let's talk about a network then. Well, where did I miss that? Here we go.
Ownable is a very central core concept in human cognition. I think it is worth considering keeping.
Yeah. From a business perspective, again, you know, a business will talk about their assets. Their assets, you know, if you're going to sell the business, you're selling the assets. You know, and so trying to define your assets solely in terms of rights probably would lead to some confusing modeling.
I agree.
Yep.
Um,
It's eventually the truth, but that doesn't make it the most convenient modeling language.
But actually, the real thing going on is that the ownership usually think you own a thing. Like I own my car. In reality, you only own the rights to the car. But any right is always is tied to the hip with a thing.
Well, in what way do you not own the car?
I own rights.
Yeah,
I own
hold
rights
on.
to the car. I don't own a car. Well,
Yeah,
I
you have
guess,
some rights, but not. You have a bundle of rights. You have some rights, but not others. Owning the car doesn't give you the right to drive it, for instance. That depends on having a license.
Correct.
yes, exactly.
That doesn't mean you don't own it. Just because you own something doesn't mean you can do anything you want with it. If I own a hammer, it doesn't mean I can smash your head in with it.
So to own it maybe means you have some amount of rights over it, but it's a bit fuzzy. Which rights? How many
The
rights
thing-
do you have before you
the
come
thing
up?
that
But here's the thing. I'm sticking to the thing of a car. Okay, I own the. Let us say I assert ownership over the car. That means if you take it from me, you know, you are violating the ownership. You know, I mean, I still have legal recourse to come back and say, you took my car. I have the right to, you know, destroy it. You know, I have the right to literally take it apart by piece and do what I want with the pieces, to where, you know, it does not exist anymore as a car per se. I have the right to sell it. So in what sense do I not own the car?
I think the test that's about 99% there, and we should just start with it and say, yeah, there are a few exceptions, is the right to destroy. And the reason it's only 99% there is, for instance, most people think once they've paid off their mortgage and stuff that they actually own their house. but in many cases, you cannot destroy your house, and you certainly cannot destroy the land. So destroy comes pretty close, but we should just acknowledge that it's not exactly it.
I think defining ownership is a mug's game. You're not going to be able. It's like defining cat. Yet the only thing you can do is point to cat and say, infer the definition for yourself.
I agree. So I'd like to come back to Dan. How many more slides do you have? Maybe we should let you finish if you're not already finished.
So let me just jump here.
Well, I just want to say one other thing. Ownership, as we're conceiving of it, is with reference to a legal system, correct? So some legal system confers the right of ownership. So why exactly do we have to figure out what that means? Why can't we just say ownership is whatever ownership means in this particular legal system?
Could just be a property and not a class. If you own something, just connect the owner to
again, there's the necessity of asserting or being able to say things about assets. Businesses want to know things about assets. That's what opened the conversation. Just having a property of owns doesn't necessarily get you there.
Agreed.
So okay, interesting. I think whoever said it's a mug's game, I think was very perceptive. There's always going to be edge cases. And in some sense, everything is a mug's game because there's always edge cases, but some are particularly fuzzy, and this was one of them.
I also want to dispute the ownership of land. I think land is very clearly owned. The deed records who owns the land at present. You don't own the deed.
But you don't own rights. You don't own mineral rights. Most land.
Like I said, ownership is a bundle of rights, and exactly which rights it is depends on what kind of ownable it is.
Yep.
Right, but when you say I own something, in practice, nobody's going to want to go all the way down to the level, except for the occasional circumstance, to every single right that you own. Because that's what the mug's game, deciding for a car, exactly what right you do or don't have. And maybe you can figure that out for a car, but then what about your laptop, or what about any number of other things?
See, this is why I don't understand why we're trying to replicate an entire legal definition of ownership within particular legal systems. I mean, what you can own in one legal system is going to be different from what you can own in another, and what exactly it means to own that is also different. So why don't we say this thing is owned, person A or agent A owns resource B within a legal system that has assigned ownership?
I mean, here's a possibility. If you just put out on the table, let's try to avoid having a new class if we can get away with it. So if we can get away with not having ownable, what would we do instead? Well, you'd have a relationship called owns, and then you could have shackle, if you like, requiring that the range has different things or not. And then it's not baked into just itself.
I'm not certain that gives you and somebody needs to mute. I'm not certain that gets us where we need to go in terms of a business handling their assets, because everything that a company owns isn't necessarily an asset they're going to track. So if you tried to, if you try to infer into an asset class, I think you're going to wind up with a lot of bad data.
Well, maybe you don't need to infer into the asset class. Maybe you can assert things that are assets.
Well, you were just saying you didn't want to add the class.
But Michael,
you were saying you did not want to, if we could get away without adding classes, we should. And
well,
part
without
of the discussion,
asset is quite an important concept. And we tried, I don't remember, Dave, we tried to model that years ago at Broadridge. Forget exactly what we did with it. Something that's owned and managed, I don't remember.
So, you know, it's,
one that's in just accounting is pretty close. Yeah.
well, what we've got now.
People have assets too, and they don't necessarily manage them. I don't manage shares. There are no asset tags on them. But I definitely own.
It's easier to think of what is sellable.
Yeah, I mean,
Again, not everything can be sold.
To Michael's point about owns and ownable, the same thing as property versus ownable. I think what Dan's constructing is a class for things that can be owned even if they're not owned right now. So having an owns property would not satisfy the requirements. And whether there's value in that is what Dan is, arguing.
So I'm leaning more now towards if somebody wants that concept, they can just create some shackle and off they go to the races. We don't need to put it into GIST.
Which concept? You mean ownable?
Yeah.
I think we do.
You can say create shackle to say, well, actually, that's the potential ownership.
You have to hang it on a class. So
why do you need potential ownership? What's the use case that says, oh my God, if I don't have this, I really cannot get my application implemented? Or if I can't,
tracking
it's
system.
really clunky and awful. I don't see the use case. Ted described some kind of a characteristic, but I'm not sure that's broad enough to include just.
I would like to jump in here and maybe sidestep that question for just a second, and that is that in the nature of the world, ownership is a thing. And what we're doing with GIST is we're enabling the capabilities that reflect the world out there. True, we're focused on business, but business operates in the context of reality, right? And so just like a map, you need to have the map to understand where the roads are, but that doesn't mean you need to take them all. But if you don't have a map indicating where the roads are, or worse, if you have a map that indicates a road, for example, there was a Rand McNally map at one point that showed a bridge across the Grand Canyon, and people were forever looking for this bridge. It needs to reflect reality, and just because it's there doesn't mean you have to use it, but it is a concept that there's a lot of passion around, and I believe that it should be there even if we don't always use it.
We have the concept of owns. It's a relationship. We can create a subclass of temporal relation called ownership, which is the instance of somebody owning something over some period of time, and you can attach rights to it.
Okay.
I still don't see what the advantages of having a separate class that says what can possibly.
You still don't think asset as a class is a valuable thing to have?
I didn't say that. It may be a valuable thing to
wait. So if we want to have the class of asset, if you look at the slide that I'm displaying right now, it says an asset is equivalent to an ownable that has magnitude of some monetary value. If you leave out ownable and put in thing, is that still a valid definition?
Asset is something that actually is owned.
Thing would include debt. Thing would include liability.
Yep.
They're different.
Because when we get down to what is this disjoint with, I'm saying, well, it's disjoint with unit of measure. It's disjoint with time instant. I was going to say it was disjoint with person. You can't, I don't think it's valid to say that thing and magnitude monetary is a valid definition for asset. So what other class can you tie it to, or what can you use to create a definition of asset that does not involve the concept of ownability?
No, it does involve the concept of ownability. Well, the concept of ownership, which is the property owns. You can create an asset. Loosely speaking, an asset is something that is in fact owned by a person or an organization. I don't remember, Dave, how you've done it, but effectively that's true, I think. An asset is that is in fact owned. It's not just ownable. An asset is in fact owned. Otherwise, it's not. Whose asset is it? There's no such thing as it.
No, I would disagree with that. I don't think that asset is something that is necessarily ownable, because I would consider, say, you know, a significant other or a friend an asset to me for emotional support during a crisis. We might be having one of those now. They're an asset.
That's just an ambiguity in the English language.
That's true.
That's not the kind of asset we're talking about here.
If we talk about business purposes, I want to go back to land for a moment. If we talk about business purposes, every business in the world that owns land treats that as one of its assets. If land is not ownable, it can't be an asset by these definitions, and that's just broken.
Well, I'd like to see at least Dan's last 3 or 4 slides, so maybe
Oh,
people.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm the worst offender, but I'd like to see what else he had to say.
Yeah.
We've got a few minutes left, but not many.
Because we are running up on time. So I did throw this together because it occurred to me, you know, that this was a thing that was going to come out. You know, it's like, well, how would we model owning a right to something? And so this is one way. I'm not saying it is the only way, but you know, if you've got some instance of an agreement class, and that agreement will spell out certain rights. So it is the basis of, you know, some enumerated instances of a right. You can assert that that is an asset, you know, and then, you know, you could say that, you know, I own that right, you know, by being a party to that agreement or being a beneficiary of that agreement. But, you know, this right can be captured in a variety of ways. It could be in a collection, it could be some content. You know, I don't know all the ways in which the agreement right would be, you know, instantiated. But the point being here that you would just basically assert that, you know, this right that you get via an agreement is an asset. And I'm not particularly enthused about this model, but it is a model.
One thing I thought of was, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to finish the slides. What, down this slide to go?
Finish the slides and then
this
come back.
This is it.
Was this the last one?
Yeah.
It occurred to me that agreement could be edict. It could be an edict that nobody agreed to, but you have to, it's the edict that requires you to do something. I don't know. That's a small detail, I suppose.
Yeah.
So
overall,
go ahead, John.
Overall, I think there is a significant business use case for the ability to handle assets and ownability. There is a whole industry of managing digital assets. I've worked on a number of digital asset management systems, and ownability is so foundational to business that I think there's tremendous value in having it in GIST.
Well, Ted, explain again how it really helped you. You gave a good little outline, but I didn't follow the details.
Well, I have to represent assets and kinds of assets. There, in my world, there are financial assets, economic assets. Financial assets are created by financial instruments. So, for instance, a mortgage, we all, as mortgage holders, we think of mortgages as liabilities, but to the bank that to whom we own the mortgage is an asset, it's a financial asset, exists on paper. It is backed by collateral, which is real estate, and that's an economic asset. So there's something that joins financial assets and economic assets together, which is asset generically. But there is this concept that I hear a lot of support for it in this community, and I think in the world in general, that the idea of an asset, something with positive monetary value, what's essentially part of that is that it is ownable. And if you own it, it might have value, but it can never be an asset. So there's a separate concept of ownership from economic
Can
value.
something be an asset if nobody owns it?
No, that's the point. It's only an asset if it's owned.
Okay, so you have to add having the ownership property to the list of to the definition of asset.
Right.
I mean, at the right end, you know.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Are you going to mail out the slides to everybody?
I am also in GitHub. I'm going to attach these slides. There's a new GIST issue around this call, and I think it's number 220.
Yeah, I pasted a link to it in the chat, actually.
All right, very good, thank you. So I will be attaching the slides as they are right now in there, and then you know, we can open up the discussion in GitHub.
Oh, goody, lots of issues to comment on. I love it.
Yeah, Dan, this is great that you took the time to present this.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that we are over time. You know, my apologies to anybody who had a hard stop and is no longer here. But I thought this was an important concept that we needed to add into GIST. I think the discussion will need to continue a bit in GitHub before we finalize what actually winds up in the model. So I appreciate your participation.
Well, you were absolutely right that we could fill up an hour, and it looks like we could probably fill up a few more hours.
Exactly. So thank you all, and you know, look forward to talking to you again next month.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Good job.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.